Welcome to the Conflict Stories podcast with Sam and Scott, where real people share their professional and personal stories of conflict.
Whether you're looking for advice or the comfort of knowing you're not alone, Conflict Stories brings the human and positive side of conflict to the forefront.
Tune in, connect, learn, and transform.
Sam and I are very excited today to welcome our guest, Bruce Argyle, one of Australia's leading conflict resolution experts, particularly in the non-for-profit sector. In fact, I've known Bruce for over 30 years since I started my mediation journey at REFS, which is a non-profit organisation, or was a non-profit organisation in Melbourne, specialising in parent-adolescent mediation. Bruce was the CEO at REFS, where I experienced his extraordinary people skills, his sharp mind, and his ability to get things done.
Is it really 30 years ago, Scott? That sounds scary.
Don't mention it again. Bruce is a standout in the conflict resolution arena, having conducted over 700 formal mediations, developed and delivered accredited mediation training for over 6,000 people across Australia, and completed his Masters in Conflict Resolution. Beyond his expertise in multi-party disputes, Bruce has a vast knowledge of the non-for-profit sector and has a deep commitment to social justice. In recent years, he's been called in by non-profits to assist with staff and board conflicts. Bruce is also a fantastic trainer and engaging networker and someone with stacks of energy. He's owned a travel agency, a vineyard, written a book, is a JP, and was a presenter on community radio for 10 years. Wow.
I feel tired just listening to that, Scott.
You never get tired. It's great to have you here, and we're excited to dive into some of your juicy conflict stories. Welcome, Bruce.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Scott and Sam, for the generous invitation to, well, do what I enjoy most, which is talking with people.
Bruce, I always say that I love conflict as long as it's other people's conflict. What's your relationship with conflict like?
I'm exactly the same as you, Sam. I don't mind putting myself in the middle of other people's conflicts, but I prefer not to have my own. That is very, very true. And maybe that's one of the hallmarks of or the motivation perhaps for being a mediator, because as we know, conflict is just such an integral part of life.
What made you decide to become a mediator? How did that happen?
Yes, I have to go back to the little bit that Scott didn't mention on the introduction, that I used to be in another life a secondary school teacher, and was always very aware of those kids who just didn't quite fit in. They struggled at school, and so the birth of that organisation Scott mentioned, REFS, was really actually about doing something with those kids who were disconnected with families, with their school, and I came across this model that I developed that saw young mediators, actually young people, 16, 14, 18, who would sit alongside adult mediators and actually help them reconnect with their families with, as Scott knows, a huge success rate. We managed to get about 70% of those young people who were out of home, Sam, back home again, which was amazing. I don't think I answered your question, but there's a starting point.
What would be interesting there, Bruce, is to know a little bit about your childhood growing up in terms of conflict. So obviously you were helping a lot of teenagers move out of homelessness, but what about your background growing up and how conflict was dealt with in your family?
Yeah, terrific, Scott. So I'm one of five. I had the slight advantage that I had a 2-year head start on my next brother, so I'm the oldest in the family. So I think that gives you a bit of an advantage on these what should we say, family situations, perhaps a little bit of favoritism or something. But yes, like all families, I think the conflicts that you have with your siblings are certainly real. You know, sharing a bedroom with a brother, one of you who likes a tidy room and the other one less so. And I can still remember actually having a string along the floor in our bedroom that I share with my brother, because his was, well, we won't say which was the messy side, but one of the sides was messy and the other one was really tidy. And I can always remember that, thinking that string is really important or something. But Scott, we were on a farm, so we were part of a village, a community, if you like. We had the normal neighbour conflicts over fences. That's, I think, one of the most common conflicts, isn't it? Still, with neighbours, fences and trees and barking dogs. I think are the big three, aren't they? So what I learned from my parents was the importance of respecting people, people with different views of the world, and they had a very strong social justice bent, and that really led me into the work that I went into, which was youth work and mediation and so on, wanting to ensure that voices were heard, and that includes, Scott, voices of people who are in conflict. And as we might talk about later, one of the most empowering things about mediation, about conflict resolution, is giving an avenue for people to be heard, to be listened to know that the other party that previously they haven't been able to get through to or connect with has heard their point of view, even if they don't agree with it.
Nice, I like that.
I was just thinking, with the teenagers that you worked with, was that a key issue for them, the sense that as a teenager that the adults weren't listening to them?
Absolutely, Sam. And what I got to see over more than 10 years doing parent-adolescent mediations were that the same issues came up all the time. And so for the young person who was typically in conflict with a step-parent, a parent possibly, it was freedom, communication, choices. For the parent, of course, it's responsibilities, which we say respect, and probably communication as well. So, but it was interesting, Sam, if I could go off on a tangent, that these young people who were very much in conflict with a parent or step parent at age 14, 15, 18, roll on 10 years later, the values that I saw in those young people 10 years on were exactly the same as their parents. So they went full circle, and that was really the basis. So even in those family conflicts, there was enough, should we say, common values that enabled you to get there and roll on. They were espousing the same things as their parents were 10 years on.
I guess it's kind of a phase, isn't it? When you're a teenager, you want that independence, and that's when the communication barriers break down. What sort of things do you think really helped start that conversation happening between the parents or the step parents and the teenagers?
Yes, Sam, the biggest strength of that early mediation model that we used was having a young person as a mediator who we matched up. So if we had a 15-year-old girl in conflict with a step parent, let's say, just imagine the power dynamics around the round table that we had in a neutral venue with a young 15-year-old mediator who perhaps maybe looked the same or was from the same ethnic background or something, sitting there at the table. So it wasn't just a bunch of adults there to sort out this kid, but rather, them actually seeing that they had someone who, given they were the same age, that they would understand where they were coming from. Yeah, that was probably the most powerful bit.
I guess especially as the teenagers, often their resentment is that adults are always telling them what to do. So having another teenager in the room made them feel a bit more valued and their voice valued. And you demonstrated that by including a teenager whose voice was sort of not authoritarian in terms of the content, but in terms of process.
Absolutely, Sam. And it was just interesting, and Scott, you've experienced this too, seeing the dynamic of a group in conflict around the table and actually seeing them hear each other, perhaps for the first time, Sam, that they actually may not reach a point of an agreement yet, but they actually hear each other, and perhaps the beginnings of understanding are there.
So that's interesting, Bruce, because I think that there's so much power in feeling heard and understood. And that's what I've seen as a mediator. And as you say, with young people, they don't usually feel heard and understood. And I liked how you said earlier, they don't have to agree at that stage. They just have to understand each other. And I think that's interesting because I know you've done a lot of multi-party conflicts, and I'm really interested to know what you've seen with the difference between, say, two parties, whether it be parent-adolescent or workplace conflict, and then I know you've worked with boards as well. But what's the big difference or the insight you've had with when you have number of people? And I'd like to know what sort of numbers you've had. I've done a 10-party mediation in Nimbin. That was a really interesting one. But what sort of numbers when you're talking bigger disputes, and what's the difference with those?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges for those of us who sit in a mediator role is maintaining our neutrality at that point, whether it's 30 seconds into the mediation or 3 minutes or probably not much longer than that, when you as the mediator subconsciously feel that one party is more reasonable than the other. And so you find yourself after 30 seconds, that's about all, internally siding with one party or feeling that their views, there's nothing wrong with them. And by inference, the other party, get your act together and see how reasonable they are. But the challenge for us as mediators is to keep that inside and continue to treat the parties in that dispute equally, fairly, and with respect, and make sure that even those views that you as the mediator might think are pretty unreasonable, that those views are still heard. Perhaps an example, Scott, and I'm not trying to one-up you, Scott, the biggest multi-party dispute I've done is 16 people. Let's say it's a hospital ward, and in this particular case, the power imbalance was at the extreme. So visualize a ward, a head of the ward, with one person who was kind of on their side, and the other 14 were in open revolt at the leader's style, communication. They felt that she was unreasonable, and the board called me in to basically sort it. And how, as a mediator, do you approach it when you've got 14 on one side of the table, one that's perhaps slightly aligned, and then the person on the other side of the table making up 16? I basically thought, right, this is not going to work sitting 14 people on one side of the table and one on the other. So I split people into pairs, and I said, I want the two of you to work out what you see as the three main issues that are going on in the ward here. And naturally, I put the one person who was aligned with the supervisor and the supervisor together, and the two of them, and then the other pairs. And then I got them to come together in fours. And so pairs into fours, and then fours into eights. And as they went along, I asked them to refine their three issues, consolidate them into three. As we went in from pairs into groups of four, we were all in the one room, and we all had our butcher's paper, and it was, in a sense, Scott, getting people to work together. That's why I love whiteboards and butcher paper for mediations and conflict resolution, because once you have parties who are in dispute working towards the identification of the issues, they're actually doing something together. They're actually working together. They've actually begun that process of getting to where they need to be. And by the end of that process, we had three collective issues, admittedly with about 10 subheadings underneath, that they agreed were the issues. And from there on, we actually sorted it. And to go back to the power imbalance, the thing that I had to make sure in that scenario was that the ward supervisor was not going to walk out the door. That they still felt that this was a process that was going to ensure that they were heard too. And the fault wasn't entirely on her side either. That's one example.
I'd be interested to know what the 3 top issues were, if you still remember.
It was scheduling, communication, and roles were the 3.
Okay.
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah, very interesting.
I was thinking the 3 main issues that they came up with fit the 3 main categories of workplace conflict: task, what has to be done; process conflict, how it should be done; and then the relationship conflict. Is that a pattern that you typically see in workplaces, those 3 categories of issues?
Yes, absolutely, Sam. I was trying to think of another one I might share with you. A huge one that I got to last year, which we probably haven't got time to go into the detail with, was a conflict between 2 people who were wanting to be chair of a not-for-profit organisation nationally. And one of the parties was made to look very good by the release of some documents that should never have made it into the public arena. And so there was a breach from the board, and visualize this, Scott. Only 7 people had access to this document that was released. And so I had 2 hats in this particular instance. One was to identify how these documents had got out into the public arena, and made one person look really good and one look really bad, with an AGM just 4 weeks away. And then once we'd done that, then to get these 2 people to sit down and sort out, for the sake of this membership organisation, to sort out their differences. Very complicated.
What was the main issues in that situation for the 2 of them?
Yeah. One of them felt very strongly that his style was what was needed for this membership organisation, which was very autocratic. That sort of style versus much more of a consultative, inclusive, member-driven organisation. It was a huge difference of style. And ultimately, Scott, in this case, the members voted at the AGM, and they elected, shall we say, the more inclusive person in this instance.
And which was the person who had the favourable documents released?
Yes. So the person who had the inclusive style was the one. This was really a smear document that went out against him, and actually did quite a bit of damage among the chapters to where it was sent. And that was why they wanted to find out where it had come from. And unfortunately, of the other 6 people that had access to this document, 4 of them believed that the, shall we say, the would-be autocratic chairperson had done this because it favoured him. But actually, my investigation for my part A of this investigation discounted him. So that was a really helpful thing, that he had not done that. And that was really then the foundation to say, all right, we've sorted that bit. Now let's see how we can work together, because they were both still on the board.
It's interesting you use the word investigation, because, as a mediator, it's not usually a term you'd use. If you're investigating something, you're trying to find the facts and come to a conclusion. Whereas a mediator, we're accepting people's perspectives. We're not trying to find out the facts necessarily. So it's interesting you had a role of trying to actually determine what happened with the release of that information, and you almost were an investigator then. And then you turned into a mediator.
Yes. And at that point, just FYI, Scott, I did give the parties the option of going with a different mediator, if that was their preference. Yeah, because as you know from mediation stories, it's really important that the mediator has a mandate from the parties to actually mediate, that there is no perception, despite what I said earlier, there is no perception that the mediator is on one side or the other. Yeah.
And that might have been a harder role for you to play if you'd found that one of the parties had been the person to release that. I imagine they would not have been happy with you as the mediator if that had been your finding.
Yes, and probably I would have recused myself, I reckon, Sam, at that point.
Mm,
Yeah,
mm.
yeah.
I'm thinking that
So,
dynamic where two people are competing for the same role and then one person gets it, but they still have to keep working together. I see that pattern over and over again in workplace conflict, not necessarily in a not for profit chair of the board role, but where two people are in a workplace and they both compete for a higher role, only one gets it, and then that person becomes the manager of someone who used to be their peer. And it's like a recipe for conflict, that situation, isn't it?
oh, look, and Sam, if I could share a personal story of the sort of impact that can happen in that scenario. I was the chair of a board of a disability organisation many years ago, and uh, we had a vacancy in the CEO role, and I was effectively acting CEO as well as board chair. Not ideal anyway. We won't go there today, but uh, as part of that role, I was faced with a scenario where I had to dismiss a senior staff member, which I did reluctantly, but there was so much evidence that pointed to this person that I did that. And then, strangely enough, just 1 week later, my Yarra Valley vineyard was vandalised, and about 10% of all my mature vines were cut off about 30 centimetres from the ground, which was, to me, very distressing. I had no evidence initially on what had happened. As the police got involved in the investigation, it was fascinating to me that they were able to identify from the angle of the cuts on the vines, the blue paint that was left on the stalk, on the trunks of the vines, the angle of the cut, how old the saw was, and the 3 locations where it could have been sold because it was very new. And on that basis, we were able to work out just by the movements of a particular person that they had probably done it, but I wasn't able to prove it. But that highlighted how serious conflict can, the consequences for me personally was about $10,000 from the damage of those vines. Now, fortunately, the person who did it, and I was never able to prove it in court, doesn't know that grapevines grow just like roses, and so in a couple of years they're back there again. But the impact of that saw me in the local paper, in the media, basically saying, this is very distressing. I've had to install security cameras in the vineyard. The issue went away. Scott, I'm reminded, if I could digress again, of the conflict that I first faced way back at Refs that brought a lot of things home to me and on how to handle a conflict situation and how not to. I arrived at the office one morning. I was going actually to school, probably to run one of your programs, Scott, on fighting fair or something like that, on conflict resolution. And there was a gentleman sitting at the front door there. You remember the ref's office. And he was sitting there reading a Bible, actually. And his name was Bruce. That's true. And he wanted to engage me. All I wanted to do was to grab my tub of materials and manuals and out the door to the school. But anyway, he wanted to have a lengthy chat. And I said to him, look, Bruce, I said, I'll try and find someone. I can't talk to you right now. He said, okay. So I went over the road to the Salvation Army, and the captain agreed that he would come over and talk with Bruce, who seemed sort of agitated. When I came back and told Bruce that, he said, I can remember the words, does Muhammad come to the mountain, or does the mountain go to Muhammad? In other words, he could come over here. I'm not going over there. And so I was back to square one, and Bruce wasn't going over the road. I said, look, Bruce, I've got to go. I've got 30 students at school I'm running a course for. He said, oh, can I just come in and use the phone? Okay. At that point, I unlocked the front door, allowed him to go in, and the blanket that he'd had across his knees, dropped, and here's this sword, a very long sword there. And I've let him into the office. And you might recall now, Sam, that this is going back a few years, but he described himself as the last of the Highlanders. Once I'd let him into the office, and he became more and more agitated as we went in, and I'm thinking, you fool, Bruce, you've let him into the office, and the ref staff had started to arrive. This is how not to handle a conflict. One of them then quietly rang the police and said, please, this guy is very agitated. Just if you're coming down, just quietly. We think there's mental health issues. By this stage, he's getting very wound up, and we suddenly have a siege situation. This is absolutely true. He's on the front steps. There's 6 of us in the building. We've locked the door. We've managed to get him out. And here he is on the front steps waving this very long sword, making threatening noises and so on. And of course, what happens next? The police arrive with full-blown sirens, the whole thing. And by this stage, there's onlookers on the street. There's probably 200 people on the main street there, Scott. And we've got a siege situation, a very hostile person waving a sword, threatening anybody who comes along. The funny part, by the way, in the middle of this, Sam, was that the elderly lady from the Salvation Army over the road came around with a tea tray, offering tea and coffee to everybody on the street, and including the guy who was the protagonist here. He got a cup of tea as well. We could say maybe they should have put something in it, but anyway, they didn't. So the end of this conflict scenario is that the police arrive with a SWAT team in a helicopter and a SWAT, and full on. There was marksmen on the roof, about 5 of them, and I don't know how many police, quite a few, and they took him down with a dog and put him in a panel van. And I was on the 7 o'clock news talking about the last of the Highlanders and the conflict and how we'd handled it, Scott. It was great. It was great publicity for refs, I must say, at the time, on how well we had handled this very difficult situation.
Wow, I don't remember that one, so it must have been before my time. That's pretty wild.
Scott, you should have been there talking about how to have a difficult conversation with the Highlander. Well, what would your tip be in that situation, Scott?
Don't engage, because I think if they're not in a good state, we need to be very careful about how we speak to them. But I haven't done a lot of hostage negotiations or anything like that. So
I'm thinking though, the Salvation Army lady, if she got to give him a cup of tea, maybe she was the appropriate mediator in that situation.
Yes.
She attended to his needs and treated him as a human being who might like a cup of tea. Maybe that was a really smart move.
It was sort of unbelievable to see it happening, in the midst of this very tense situation, and this very small elderly lady, she literally had the tray with the cups of tea on it, and walked right up to him. You're quite right, Sam. I agree with you. We didn't do it right. We should have learned something.
There's a couple of things that tie in with what you said before. He wanted to be heard and you were in a hurry. Ironically, you probably didn't make your training given what happened.
I didn't.
I bet you didn't. But, he wanted to be heard. You were in a hurry. He was feeling more and more agitated at not being heard. The Salvation Army person wasn't coming over to him. And I imagine that escalated to a situation where it was such an enormous power imbalance. It was everybody against him. And then, as you said, the police with all of the snipers and what have you. You can imagine at that point, the poor man was not going to be able to think rationally and didn't feel like being cooperative, given that no one was listening to him. It was him against, I don't know, however many, 50 people and all the spectators, and he's also embarrassed. The poor man had nowhere to go, didn't he? I feel really sorry for him, and it's unfortunate the police didn't pay attention to what you'd asked them to do, which was to come quietly and sensitively, because that may have resulted in something a little less dramatic.
It absolutely would have, Sam. And I think your point's really well made, and probably goes back to the power imbalance we were talking about before. That it's nearly always evident, Scott, isn't it? That there's very few conflicts that I've been involved with where the power's evenly shared. In most cases, one person has much more power, and it's not always the person you expect. I'm thinking back to a mediation I did with a single mother, and an 18-year-old, where the power was all with the 18-year-old, like the whole lot. And when I say that, here was a scenario where this 18-year-old was just totally in control, was treating mum quite abusively, which included, at the extreme, locking mum out of the house. And I sat there as the mediator, trying to empower mum to just say something, but she wouldn't. I couldn't get from mum, even with my support as a mediator, I couldn't get her to stand up for herself. And so this 18-year-old in this case was just walking all over mum. And it was very sad to see. And we didn't get a resolution in that case.
And that's one of the challenges, isn't it, is that assessing for appropriateness in terms of, is this the right intervention? And that's one of the things we have to determine, isn't it? And sometimes in hindsight you see that. And particularly when it starts getting into abuse or violence, then it's a different kettle of fish, really, isn't it? So, is this the right intervention? I think that's always something we have to consider when it starts to get more extreme.
And there's always a risk if we artificially balance power in a mediation that there'll be payback afterwards.
Yes.
Maybe you give mum a forum to stand up for herself in that room when you're there to be a safety mechanism for her, but what is the son going to do to her afterwards as payback when we can't monitor what's happening and protect them?
You've highlighted something that I think is really important, and that is that we need to be thinking post-mediation what's going to happen. And if I could just say, by way of a couple of examples, that in my experience, the most common fault of mediators is a failure to build in a review mechanism after the mediation. So every mediation I ever do, I always build in, at least offer after 4 weeks. If things are very delicate, it's after 1 week or 2 weeks. But if we've sorted issues and so on, it's after 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 6 months or whatever, but always a review so that those parties have got somewhere in the back of their mind that there's going to be accountability to what they agreed to. And I've seen mediations unravel because there was just no keeping them honest. There was no review afterwards. Your point's well made, Sam.
I think the other thing is you can come to agreements where the parties, meeting their needs, they're comfortable, they're committed to it. And even if you write that up in their words very clearly, there's usually going to be something that perhaps doesn't work as expected. And so in their minds, they can sometimes be quite black and white about that, where they go, oh, okay, well, therefore the whole thing, they throw the whole thing out as well. So it's like, how do you set it up that we've got some great agreements and we need to check, as you say, in a few weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, 2 weeks, whatever, just to see how they're going, because they're not always going to work perfectly, and we want to check in and make sure that they are going in the right direction.
In workplaces, one of the potential issues is that when the people come into the mediation, they've had their allies. They've had people who they've been talking to about how horrible the other person is and how unreasonable the situation is. And then they have a mediation where they do hear each other and share and come to an agreement. But they go back into the workplace and all their allies are oblivious to this big shift in their thinking. And so the allies are like, what? Why are you now talking to them? What about all those things you said? And so there's almost this sort of negative peer pressure to go back on the things that they agreed to in that more reasonable space. So one of the things I would always do is ask people, how are they going to explain this shift in their thinking and behaviours, hopefully, to the other people who've been watching this conflict play out, because otherwise the system doesn't support them to follow through.
Yes, yes. No, great point, Sam, and just very, very, very true. I can only find myself nodding to what you're saying.
Bruce, I'm really curious about what you think is your biggest challenge in conflict, either personally or professionally. What's the thing that for you just seems the most difficult part of conflict?
I think on the back of what I was saying before about naturally feeling one party is more reasonable than the other, the other, I think the hardest part for the mediator is being able to see a solution that could actually, as you were saying, Scott, meet the needs of each of the parties, but being able to get them there. A good mediator is not supposed to give advice. They're not supposed to make suggestions. They are to remain neutral and help the parties come up with their own solutions. We know that. Sometimes you sit there as the mediator or as a co-mediator, and you're just sitting there thinking, why don't you just, like it's as plain as, and it is so frustrating that you can't seem to get them there. You ask all the obvious questions. What do other people do in these situations? What have you thought about doing? Can either of you see any solution here? And it's still, you get nothing. And it's like, guys, I can see 2 or 3 solutions here. And as a mediator, you're just not supposed to suggest them. So what do you do in that situation, Sam? I'd be interested to ask you that.
I ask a series of circular questions and go round and round of what I see, getting closer and closer until you get to that point where you think, oh, I'm just about making a suggestion now. I need to pull back a little bit. I guess I have to keep reminding myself that even though it seems really obvious to me, there might be a really good reason that they're not going there. And so that's my way of reassuring myself that I've done everything I can. I've asked lots of questions going around it and coming at it from different angles. And if they're still not going there, then I have to assume there's a good reason for it and I have to let it go. But it is really frustrating. And when you've done a lot of mediations, you know the kinds of things that tend to work. So it can be very hard not to be sitting there thinking, guys, it's so obvious what the answer is.
Occasionally I have resorted, Sam, when we just get stuck there and we've identified the issues, we've done a bit of negotiation, but we can't seem to get to those solutions. I give them homework and say, look, are we happy to continue the conversation? Can I ask each of you to think about it during the week, maybe talk to a couple of people that have been in similar situations, or get some advice, get some professional advice if it's a legal issue or a workplace issue or something, and then we'll come back next week. And often people move in that week as well.
There's different opinions about whether you should do that. Some people will be like, don't let them go, because it'll all fall apart. But I think you're actually right that giving them that space to reflect and think a little bit more about it is often what people need to reach a sustainable agreement.
Yeah.
Talking of that, Sam, I remember when I first got my first job, but I remember them saying, well, we used to do 7-hour mediations. They definitely got outcomes because the people weren't allowed to leave until we got an outcome. What's your longest mediation, Bruce?
Longest, I think, about 4 hours would be roughly, Scott, with a break in there, but always checking whether the party, always giving them control of the session. Are we, are willing to continue? Would you like to come back? Look, Scott, I think 2 solid hours is probably enough for most people, to be honest. It's frustrating, though. I was doing a mediation just before Christmas, and this was actually a separated couple, and they were trying to work out custody, finances, ongoing relationship, property. So it was quite complex, and we were in a neutral venue, and neither of the parties wanted to stop. So we kept going, and it was nearly 4 hours. I would have stopped much sooner, but they just wanted to keep going. And I think in hindsight, I wish I'd pulled it up. quicker, because I don't think it helps. Sadly, this particular one I'm just thinking of now, these two people, we got the issues, we went through it, and on the third session, they were ready to sign, and they came, and it's sad to report to you guys that right at the 12th hour, as they were coming along, I'd typed up all the agreements. They're not legally binding. They were just a goodwill agreement that they were going to use to separate property and so on. One of the parties refused to sign, and it all unraveled. And I looked at my probably 8 hours that I'd spent in mediation with these two, and they were so close. And just to see it unravel, that's hard, Sam, when you get that close.
What do you think was going on there? What was the trigger for that unraveling?
It was a sense, one of the parties was playing the victim, and just perhaps in between those sessions, Sam, as you've identified, perhaps was talking to, I suspect, talking to other family members and or friends, and they were saying, "What, you're doing? What, you're agreeing to such and such? You must be mad," kind of stuff. And suddenly, oh yeah, what, I must be mad, I'm not doing it, or something. That's my suspicion. Yeah, very, very tough. But for the mediator, I mean, my greatest fulfillment as a mediator is knowing that you have brought two people together who may not even be willing to be in the same room without you, who are in conflict, and you, as the neutral third party, help them address it and come up with a solution. And I think there's nothing more rewarding as a mediator than knowing that without you, they wouldn't be in a relationship, they wouldn't have sorted that out, they wouldn't be where they are now. And that gives me the biggest buzz of all.
Very nice. And following on from that, Bruce, what would you say your greatest gift is as a mediator?
It's not a time to be modest.
Yeah, no mind. We don't talk ourselves up enough.
Yes. I think it's conveying to each party respect. I think it's respect. And so that the people in the room feel all of the things we've talked about already, that they're going to be heard, they're going to be listened to, they're going to be understood, and so on. But unless they're respected as a person, I don't think you get there. I think respecting people, valuing people, respecting people is at the heart of good mediation.
Bruce, in what way do you think conflict has transformed your life?
Great question. I used to think that conflict resolution was helping people compromise. And it's far from that. The old adage, Scott, that we've read, flatmates in a conflict, male and female, toilet seat up, toilet seat down, conflict. So the compromise is the 45-degree toilet seat, which just doesn't work for either of them. The solution to a conflict is not always compromise. It's sometimes a solution that's way over on the left-hand side that you wouldn't have even thought of, that doesn't even make sense to you as a mediator, but they're happy to do it. There are other ways of addressing conflict without going down the legal route. The two brothers that I was asked to mediate, two adult brothers that I was asked to mediate in Sydney, who were in dispute following the death of their parents over a very expensive property in Potts Point. And the source of the conflict was that one of the brothers had spent a couple of months living in the house after the parents had passed, and that upset the other brother because he wasn't paying for it. And this is absolutely true. Before I got involved, these two, over a period of 3 years, had spent $400,000 on legal fees. $400,000. And so I was Johnny come lately, probably an afterthought, Scott, or something on the mediator, and brought these two people together. I can still remember it like yesterday, thinking, you spent $400,000 in legal fees on this petty dispute that was probably worth, $10,000 or something. So to go back to the question, Sam, I think for me personally, it's seeing the power of mediation, the power of getting people together around the table in a respectful environment where they're going to be heard and they can come up with their own solutions is very empowering. Scott, in all of the books I've read, Getting to Yes, Getting Past No, Fisher and Urey, my favourite story is not the one about the oranges. It's the one about the mediator who comes in to sort out the dispute about the camels. You've heard that, haven't you, Sam?
I don't know if I have.
No.
You have to remind me.
So this desert sheik dies, and he leaves his camels. He's got 19 camels, and he leaves them to his 3 sons, right? His will says that one son, the oldest son, will get half the camels, and the next son will get a quarter of the camels, and the next son will get a fifth of the camels. And the mediator arrives on his camel and quickly assesses the situation and adds his camel to the estate. So there are now 20 camels. And so the first son gets half the camels, that's 10 camels. The second one gets a quarter of the camels, that's 5. And the next one gets a fifth of the camels, that's 4. That's 19 camels. And the mediator jumps on his camel and rides away. Problem solved. And the reason I love that story is that as a mediator, you bring something to the conflict. And we don't arrive on camels, but we do bring resources and skills and something to actually help those parties get past that conflict.
Communication is a bit of a lost art these days, isn't it?
Yes, not helped probably by all our social media and other things that distract us. We haven't really talked about communication per se, but we 3 know, don't we, that at the heart of most of these conflicts is a breakdown in communication at some level.
Yeah. Bruce, and you already have, I guess, shared some of your conflict pearls, but if you were to finish off with one conflict pearl, almost like advice, if you like, what would that be?
Don't be scared to sit down with the person or the persons that you're in conflict with. Yes, it has to be a safe environment, whatever safe means, whether that's support people, whether it's with a mediator, whether it's, whatever that looks like. But don't walk away from it, because guess what? It won't go away and it's probably going to get worse. Look at the volume of neighbourhood conflicts on most local government websites. They're in the thousands, and they are dogs and fences and trees. And many people in those situations, they don't actually sit down and try and talk with the person that they're in conflict with. Like a percentage of those conflicts would be sorted just by leaning over the fence or, just somehow safely talking to the other person.
Thank you, Bruce. Do you want to sum it up, Sam? You're good at summaries.
It would help a lot, wouldn't it, if people could actually talk to each other about the things that were challenging for them. But unfortunately, we do still need mediators. There's not any lack of conflict in this world. So everybody, my pearl to end is to be like Bruce and keep working towards a more peaceful future.
And I'd like to say, enjoy your conflict.
Thanks, Bruce. It was a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Scott. Great to see you again. And happy conflict resolution, everyone.